The shadow on the monitor. Mia was a first-time mom, and the baby monitor had quickly become her lifeline. It allowed her to keep an eye and an ear on her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, while she tackled household chores. The monitor was one of those high-tech ones with video, night vision, and even a two-way speaker. Mia loved the peace of mind it gave her, until one night it didn't. It was a quiet evening. Mia had put Lily down for the night, her tiny body swaddled and tucked snugly into her crib. The nursery glowed with the soft, warm light of a night lamp shaped like a star. Everything was calm. Mia sat down in the living room, folding laundry with one eye on the baby monitor screen. The feed showed Lily's crib in crisp, black and white night vision. She was sleeping soundly, her little chest rising and falling rhythmically. Mia hummed to herself as she worked, feeling content. But then something caught her eye. On the monitor in the corner of the room, a faint shadow moved. She paused, staring at the screen. It was probably just the light from outside, she told herself. Maybe a car's headlights passing by or the sway of the tree branches outside the window. But the shadow didn't move like light. It was slow, deliberate. It seemed to stretch and grow, creeping along the nursery wall like a living thing. Mia's heart began to race. She switched on the two-way speaker. "Hello? Is someone in there?" Her voice echoed eerily through the monitor, but there was no response. She stood up, gripping the monitor tightly, and started toward the nursery. But before she could reach the door, Lily stirred on the screen. Her tiny head turned to the side and her eyes opened. Lily wasn't crying. She wasn't scared. She was staring directly at the shadow. Mia froze in the hallway, watching as the shadow seemed to shift closer to the crib. It wasn't on the wall anymore. It was on the floor, rising up slowly, almost like it was taking shape. She burst into the nursery, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear herself breathe. The room was empty. There was no shadow, no movement, nothing out of the ordinary. Just Lily, lying in her crib, wide awake but calm. Mia checked every corner of the room, every possible hiding spot. She even looked under the crib, her hands trembling as she lifted the skirt. Nothing. Feeling shaken, she picked Lily up and held her close. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. She decided to keep Lily in her room that night, setting up the crib beside her bed. She left the baby monitor on, just in case. Hours passed and Mia finally drifted off to sleep. But in the middle of the night, the monitor crackled. A whisper came through. "She's mine." Mia bolted upright, her eyes darting to the monitor. The screen was filled with static now, the nursery camera feed completely gone. And then she noticed something horrifying. The shadow was in her room. It wasn't on the wall or the floor. It was at the foot of her bed. A tall, inky black figure, featureless but unmistakably there. Mia screamed and grabbed Lily, clutching her daughter tightly to her chest. She flipped on every light in the room, but when the bulbs flared to life, the shadow was gone. Shaking, she called her husband, who was out of town for work, and told him everything. He tried to calm her down, assuring her it was just exhaustion or a bad dream. But Mia knew better. She threw out the monitor the next day. But even now, months later, Mia still feels like she's being watched at night. Sometimes she wakes up to find Lily staring at the corner of the room, smiling at something Mia can't see. And every now and then, just as she's drifting off to sleep, she swears she hears the faint whisper, "She's mine." The whisper on the baby monitor. It started on a chilly autumn night. Jessica had just put her 6-month-old son, Caleb, to bed in his nursery. The small room was warm, filled with soft, glowing light from a woodland-themed nightlight on the wall. The baby monitor sat on her nightstand, its green light blinking softly, ready to pick up the faintest sound from Caleb's room. Jessica settled into her bed, a novel in hand, and let herself relax. She hadn't had much sleep since Caleb was born, and tonight felt like a rare chance to catch up on rest. Caleb had been unusually quiet all evening, drifting to sleep without his usual fussing. As she turned a page, the monitor crackled. She paused, listening. It was likely just Caleb stirring. She reached over to turn up the volume. Through the faint static, she heard a voice. It wasn't Caleb's cry. It wasn't the usual rustling of blankets. It was a faint, melodic whisper. Jessica froze, her heart pounding. The voice was low, almost sing-song. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was soothing. Too soothing. It sounded like someone was whispering a lullaby. Dropping her book, she sat up straight and stared at the monitor. The small screen showed Caleb's crib, still and undisturbed. He was lying there, motionless, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily in sleep. "Hello," Jessica called, her voice shaky, as if whoever was on the other side could hear her. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Jessica's mind raced. Could the monitor be picking up a neighbor's signal? Maybe someone's TV? She reminded herself that baby monitors could sometimes intercept frequencies from other devices. It had to be a technical glitch. Just as she began to relax, the whispering started again. This time it was clearer. "Hush now. Sleep, little one." Jessica's stomach dropped. She knew this wasn't a neighbor's TV. She shot out of bed and rushed to Caleb's room, flipping on the light as she entered. The nursery was empty except for Caleb, who lay fast asleep in his crib. There was no one there. She checked every corner of the room, her hands trembling as she pushed aside the curtains and opened the closet. Nothing. No sign of anyone. As she stood in the quiet room, the baby monitor in her hand crackled again. "Why did you wake him up?" Jessica gasped and dropped the monitor. The voice sounded annoyed this time, almost angry. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she snatched Caleb from his crib and backed out of the room. She turned off the monitor and rushed back to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. For the rest of the night, she stayed awake, holding Caleb tightly in her arms. The next morning, Jessica called her husband, David, who was away on a business trip, and told him everything. He tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just interference or a prank, but she wasn't convinced. Over the next few nights, the whispers continued. Each time, they grew more persistent, more insistent. "Put him back. He belongs here. You're making a mistake." Jessica stopped using the baby monitor, relying instead on a camera app on her phone to check on Caleb. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. One night, as she lay awake, Caleb let out a sudden cry. She grabbed her phone to check the camera feed and froze. On the screen, she saw Caleb standing in his crib, staring directly at the camera. His eyes looked wrong. They were darker than usual, like two black voids. A faint smile played on his lips as he raised a tiny hand and pointed at the monitor in her room. Then the camera feed cut to static. Jessica bolted into Caleb's room, but when she got there, he was lying down, fast asleep, as if nothing had happened. She never used a baby monitor or camera again. To this day, Jessica can't explain what happened during those sleepless nights, but one thing is certain. There was something, or someone, trying to get close to her son. The mimic. It started with small things. At first, Mia thought it was just her exhaustion playing tricks on her. After all, being a mom to a teething 8-month-old was no easy task. Sleep was a luxury, and her nights were mostly spent soothing her baby, Theo, back to sleep. The baby monitor was her trusted companion, allowing her to grab a few moments of rest while still keeping an eye on Theo. The device had a clear audio feed, and though the static sometimes buzzed faintly, it usually gave her a sense of reassurance. Until it didn't. One night, after putting Theo to bed, Mia collapsed onto the couch. Her husband, Jake, was working late, so the house was eerily quiet. The monitor sat on the coffee table, its green light glowing softly. Mia flipped on a mindless TV show, hoping to stay awake long enough to finish her glass of wine. A soft rustling sound came through the monitor. She glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat, but the screen showed Theo asleep in his crib, his tiny body curled up and peaceful. Then she heard it. "Mama." Mia froze, the monitor in her hand. It wasn't Theo's sweet baby babble. It was too clear, too articulated. It sounded like a child's voice, but older. "Mama." The voice came again, faint and drawn out, almost sing-song. Mia's stomach twisted. Theo couldn't say mama yet. He wasn't even close. She stared at the monitor, her eyes scanning the grainy image of the nursery. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place. She decided it was just interference. Maybe the neighbor's monitor was crossing signals with hers. She'd heard of that happening before. Brushing it off, she turned off the TV and headed to bed. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. She had just settled into bed, the monitor perched on her nightstand, when the soft static was interrupted by giggles. High-pitched, childish giggles. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the monitor and stared at the screen. Theo was lying in his crib, still as could be, but the giggling continued, echoing faintly through the speaker. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The giggling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice. "Mama." It was the same voice as before, but now it sounded closer, more deliberate. Mia bolted out of bed and ran to the nursery. She flung open the door, her heart pounding, and turned on the light. Theo was fast asleep, his little face peaceful and unbothered. She checked every corner of the room, her hands shaking as she pulled back the curtains and peered under the crib. Nothing. Still, she couldn't shake the unease. The following day, she told Jake about it. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to faulty equipment. "I'll get us a new monitor tomorrow," he said, kissing her forehead. But that night the mimic returned. Mia had just fallen asleep when the sound of crying jolted her awake. Theo's crying. She grabbed the monitor and saw him sitting up in his crib, his little face red and scrunched up as he wailed. "Mama!" The voice came again through the monitor. Mia froze. The voice didn't match Theo's cries. It was louder, clearer, and it came with a strange echo, as though it wasn't coming from the room at all. And then she heard it. Theo's actual cries were still coming through the monitor, but something else was crying with him. A mimic. She raced to the nursery, her heart slamming in her chest. But when she opened the door, the room was silent. Theo was asleep. The monitor in her hand still crackled with static. And then, from the speaker, she heard her own voice. "Who's there?" Her breath caught in her throat. That was what she had said the night before. The monitor repeated it again, the sound distorted but unmistakably her own. "Who's there?" Mia's hands trembled as she turned off the monitor and grabbed Theo from his crib. She didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, she threw the monitor in the trash. But even without it, the mimic didn't leave. Now she sometimes hears Theo crying from the nursery, only to find him sound asleep in her arms. Sometimes, when Jake is away, she hears his voice calling to her from another room, only to remember he isn't home. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is dark and quiet, she hears her own voice whispering softly from the baby monitor she thought she got rid of. "Mama!" A crawling shadow. It began on a quiet, rainy night. Hannah had just settled into the worn-out recliner in the living room, Her baby monitor balanced on the armrest. Her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, had gone down surprisingly easy that night, leaving her with a rare moment to relax. The storm outside was relentless. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. But inside, the baby monitor emitted its usual soft static, a reassuring sound that all was well. Hannah sighed, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. The faint glow of the baby monitor's screen caught her attention. She glanced at it, smiling as she saw Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath. But then she saw it. In the corner of the screen, a shadow shifted. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. The nursery was dark, and the monitor's night vision always made things look a little grainy. But as she squinted at the screen, she realized the shadow was moving. Slowly, deliberately. It crept across the floor, its shape unnatural, almost insect-like. Hannah's stomach tightened. She leaned closer to the screen, her fingers gripping the armrest. The shadow stopped at the base of Lily's crib. For a moment, everything was still. Hannah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then the shadow began to climb. It moved in an unsettling way, as though it were alive but not entirely human. Its limbs stretched and contorted, pulling it up the crib's wooden bars. Hannah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run to the nursery, to grab Lily and get her out of there, but her body wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, staring at the screen as the shadow reached the top of the crib. It leaned over her daughter. "No," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved. It melted into the darkness of the room, leaving no trace behind. Hannah didn't sleep that night. She spent hours sitting outside Lily's door, listening for any sound, watching the monitor like a hawk. But nothing else happened. The next day, Hannah tried to brush it off as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. That evening, she told her husband, Mark, about what she'd seen. He laughed it off, calling it a trick of the light or a glitch in the monitor. "It's probably just interference," he said, ruffling her hair playfully. "You've been watching too many horror movies." But Hannah knew what she saw. The following night, the crawling shadow returned. Hannah was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard a strange noise coming from the baby monitor. It wasn't Lily's usual whimpers or cries. It was a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. She dried her hands hastily and grabbed the monitor. Her heart sank. The shadow was back. It crawled across the nursery floor, its movements more erratic this time. It darted toward the rocking chair in the corner, then to the changing table, before finally stopping at the crib. Hannah's hands trembled as she watched. She could see Lily stirring slightly, her tiny arms twitching as though she sensed something was wrong. The shadow loomed over her, stretching taller and taller until it seemed to fill the entire room. Without thinking, Hannah bolted up the stairs, her fear giving way to pure adrenaline. She burst into the nursery, flipping on the light. The room was empty. Lily was still in her crib, fast asleep. The rocking chair was still, the changing table undisturbed. But the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though something unseen was watching her. Over the next few days, things escalated. The shadow began appearing earlier in the evening, lingering longer each time. Hannah started noticing other strange things, too. Toys would move on their own. Lily's mobile, which hadn't worked in weeks, would suddenly spin and play its haunting lullaby in the middle of the night. And then there were the whispers. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Hannah would hear faint murmurs coming through the baby monitor. At first, she thought it was static or interference, but the more she listened, the more she realized the whispers were saying her name. Hannah. She couldn't take it anymore. She begged Mark to call someone, anyone who could help. He still didn't believe her but agreed to humor her. They contacted a local priest to bless the house, hoping it would put an end to the nightmare. For a while, it seemed to work. The shadow disappeared and the house felt lighter. Hannah started to relax, thinking it was all over. But she was wrong. A week later, the shadow returned, stronger than ever. This time, it didn't stay confined to the nursery. Hannah saw it creeping down the hallway, its dark, shifting form slithering along the walls. One night, she woke up to find it hovering at the foot of her bed. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was watch as it crawled closer, its featureless form radiating malice. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, a sound that made her blood run cold. "She's mine now." The next morning, Hannah packed a bag, grabbed Lily, and left the house. Mark stayed behind, still refusing to believe in the shadow. He regretted it. That night, while alone in the house, Mark called Hannah in a panic. "It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's in the room with me." The call cut off abruptly. When Hannah returned with the police, the house was empty. There was no sign of Mark, no sign of the shadow. But in the nursery, scrawled on the wall in dark, jagged letters, were the words, "She's mine now." Hannah never went back to the house, but the nightmare didn't end there. She stayed with her sister in a neighboring town, hoping the distance would keep her and Lily safe. For the first few nights, things seemed calm. Lily slept soundly, and the oppressive heaviness that had haunted Hannah began to lift. But it wasn't gone. On the fifth night, Hannah woke to a familiar sound, the faint static from the baby monitor. Her heart sank. She deliberately left the old monitor behind, buying a brand new one after leaving the house. As she sat up in bed, she realized the monitor wasn't even turned on. The static was coming from the corner of her room. She slowly turned her head, her body trembling. There, in the darkness, was the shadow. It was no longer confined to the nursery, no longer confined to the screen. It loomed impossibly large, its tendrils writhing and stretching toward her like smoke given life. "Leave us alone," she screamed, clutching the blanket as if it could protect her. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was no longer interested in Hannah. Instead, it turned and slithered toward the adjoining room where Lily was sleeping. "No!" Hannah screamed, bolting out of bed. She raced into the nursery, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow was already there, coiled around the crib like a living shroud. Lily was awake, her tiny eyes wide with terror. She didn't cry. She just stared, her lips quivering as if she was too scared to make a sound. Hannah lunged forward, reaching for her daughter, but the shadow moved faster. It reared up, its form shifting into something grotesque and monstrous. For the first time, it had a face, vague and distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. "You can't have her," Hannah sobbed, her voice breaking. The shadow's mouth twisted into a cruel approximation of a smile. "She was mine before she was yours," it hissed. And then it struck. The shadow engulfed the crib, swallowing Lily whole. Hannah screamed, her voice raw, as she reached into the darkness, desperate to pull her daughter back. But her hands passed through the shadow like smoke. When it finally dissipated, the crib was empty. The police found Hannah hours later, sitting on the nursery floor, clutching Lily's favorite blanket and rocking back and forth. She was muttering incoherently, her eyes glassy and distant. They never found Lily. The house Hannah fled from was eventually sold to another family, unaware of its dark history. It wasn't long before the new owners started hearing whispers through the baby monitor and seeing shadows crawling along the nursery walls. And every time the shadow whispered the same chilling phrase, "She was mine before she was yours." If you like creepy stories like these, please subscribe to the channel.